everybody, and welcome to our interview with one of my favorite people ever in the writing world. Way back at the beginning of the podcast, you guys should not go listen to that because we didn't know what we were doing back then. But like on the second episode, I was bringing up G. Wells Taylor, one of my favorite independent, self-published authors, and he is here with us today to talk with us about all of his stuff, and I'm so pumped. Hi, G. Wells Taylor.
How you doing? Good morning.
I'm great. I'm really, really great. Now, we were talking over email. The G in your name stands for...
Jeff.
Jeff. Is it
Yeah,
okay if I call you Jeff in the interview?
Sure, yeah. That's fine.
Because if I say G. Wells Taylor every time, it's going to be a little weird for me. But it's... So I got to tell this story. You are... way back in like late mid-2000s era, I got my first e-reader. And it was a Sony e-reader thing. It had a little button on the bottom. It was really great. And I was looking for books to read on there. And of course, I was cheap back then and poor, so I didn't have any money. And I went to the site called minibooks.net. And on minibooks.net, I found several things that, older things. But I also happened to find your book, When Graveyards Yawn. It's illegal, but it's not like a pirated copy. For those of you who might be wondering, G. Wells has made this first version of that series available to people for free, and I downloaded that, and it blew my mind. I had my eyes opened to the world of what independent writing, and I'd never read anything like that before. It was so out there and bizarre and fun and unafraid and yet skillful. And I guess first off, I just got to say thank you. Thank you for introducing me to that world.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your perspective, certainly. I've over the years, I have seen, I think it's even at many books from years ago where you had left a positive review. It's very encouraging in the indie book business to get reviews.
So can you talk about a little bit of your history? Because you are really a pioneer of the digital book era. There was a time, our friend Joseph Devon had ebooks online way early in the sort of before that was really a thing, before Kindle and those things took off, and you were very much on that bleeding edge too. Can you talk about a little bit of what it was initially to be an author in the digital space and how the internet made that kind of stuff possible? What is your story getting into this? Well,
it helped to have a friend of mine, Rich Van Dyke, who's a business partner, continues to this day with the book project. He was into tech. He was one of those guys with a Tandy tape computer. And years ago, he was encouraging us, and I was still clinging to my typewriter. And but definitely, he talked me into it in time. And then we were basically had one of the first ebooks out there with When Graveyards Yawn. But the problem is no one had anything to read it on except computers and the like. So. It's been a long process, probably about 10 years, and for most of it, it's just been a promotion. I mean, obviously a lot of writing, but a lot of promotion involved.
Well, you do a lot of writing. I gotta say, you're super prolific. I'm always amazed. Every 6 months to a year, you have something new out, and it's always something, just some new spin, and there's nothing dull or uninteresting about your approach. I'm always excited by, at least how you're approaching something. And that, I don't know, I'm very, very in awe of you as a writer in general and as a pioneer in this field.
Well, thanks. I think the other thing is, as an independent, you can really, you really get to indulge yourself as an artist in that, you're going to write for an audience, but you also get to you're looking for one, right? So it's a process. I guess basically you don't have any oversight. There's no one stopping it, and so no one telling you, well, do this or this sells or that sells. And while that starts to enter your mind now, as I'm selling books, it starts to enter the mind. You can still sort of indulge yourself because you're in charge.
I wanted to ask... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tony.
I definitely saw that whenever I started reading the Wild Cloud series, because like a few pages in, I was like, man, like this is probably the best edited and well put together indie book that I've read in a long, long time. But also, I was just struck by like how much more original it was than anything I'd read for a while too. Like it's almost a peek into Al's mind, because a lot of times he gets so tired of like anything that's even moderately generic can almost be like downright offensive to him. So like whenever I start reading this, I'm like, oh, I totally get why Al is like so into this, and I definitely became a fan after reading it too. So
I think that's another thing is you do get to part of the indulging yourself is I'm also particular taste of what I like to read and in any type of entertainment. So, you're trying to keep yourself engaged as a writer too.
Speaking of keeping yourself engaged, I've noticed over the years, because I've tried to at least look at everything that you've written. I haven't read all the way through all of your books, but I've gotten my hands into what you've been working on, and I noticed that you don't have a narrowly defined voice like a lot of writers do. There's not one way that you write. You write one way with Wild Cloud. You have the hard-boiled, gritty kind of detective speak, and then you get into the Corpse Harbinger, which is set in the same world, but is very much this Sherlock Holmesian kind of thing. And then you go to one with Dracula of the Apes, where you're totally mimicking Edgar Rice Burroughs. How is it that you're able to be this chameleon with that writing voice? Because it really does seem like it's not like you've shed yourself, but you're willing to just dive into a certain way of writing and a certain style that I've not seen really from other authors, where there's nothing that you seem tethered to.
Well, I think, when it comes to something like Dracula of the Apes, where I'm paying homage to two different, writers of classics, I feel a responsibility, obviously, to do it justice. And there's a similar feeling in any of those where you're doing a riff on hard-boiled detectives in Wild Cloud, but you want to do it a service to this. Not source material, but to the style, to the vibe, and so it's a tough question. I think the other thing is, again, it goes back to indulging myself. Is that I'm playing in those worlds. Like when I get going, I'm definitely playing. I do when I'm part of the writing process. I stand up to write usually because I quite often will act out scenes or figure out a scene. Movements and so forth. I think I've got a bum knee now because of figuring out how Dracula of the Apes would move around in so forth. So it's not all fun.
It's making me think I need to make my writing style a little bit more active.
Oh yeah. Well, I really do. A lot of it has to do with play. I am really. When I'm here doing all this, doing these stories, I have to find something that's engaging to me, and then I really just start playing.
Well, and you deal, talking about play and not being afraid to go places, in several of your books, you deal with the literal end of the world in several different ways. I don't want to spoil too much for the World of Change series, but the places you go there and the sort of cataclysmic things that you have this really successful character in my mind. I mean, Wild Clown for me defines you, and I don't want to tie you down to that or say that you really need to only write Wild Clown. But for me, that is what that character is sort of what defines you. And yet you take the world that he exists in and you blow it up and move on to other stuff, and you'll go back and tell other stories with Wild Clown before that happens. But is there ever a fear that, man, what if I'm doing the wrong thing here? What if people don't respond to this? Or do you ever feel tethered to what you've done before? Or is that a joy for you to just burn down what came before and move forward and say, okay, what happens now?
There's certainly a lot of fun blowing up worlds that you've created, and because you've sort of set all the explosive, all the detonated, all the parts of the explosion. You know, this is going to blow up. These people will die. And you have some fun playing. Yeah, definitely, it's fun to do that. But a lot of these the process started before the ebook revolution, as I term it. And so you sort of had to do end pieces because I didn't really have an audience. I was putting work out there. I had an online bookstore and so forth, but we just didn't have the reach. Amazon wasn't really doing it at the time. Barnes and Noble, none of them were. So I just would sort of take a story so far and go, well, I've got to move on to other stories. But now that I have this growing readership, I now can go, well, I'm getting a lot of flack about what happened to Wild Clown there. So I can go back and address some of those issues.
You deserve to get a lot of flack for that, sir. You left us hanging big time on that cliffhanger. I'm glad the new book came out because I was like, you can't just leave him with the in mortal peril? That's not cool. I've been following this character for 3 or 4 books now. And it took a long time. I mean, I really appreciate Dracula of the Apes, but it seemed like anyway, it was a long time before we got back to Wild Clown and found out what was happening with him.
Yeah, and that's the only real problem with if to be prolific, I have to pay my bills and do so I'm busy a lot. So it's just I would love to be able to write more, but I really still have the time involved is it just takes all of my time, right? So, but I'd love to. I would have got back to these things earlier. I would have got back to them earlier, I'm sure. But the other thing is, as you're trying to develop in the first days of the ebook revolution, we were selling a lot of books, and I started thinking, well, it's all down this one avenue of Wild Clown and through. So I thought, well, I've got to open up, and I had other stories like Bent Steeple and Mother's Boy, things that might be more mainstream. So I sort of had to divide my time, and it was just, I have a lot of fun doing it, but there's only so much time in the day.
Well, and the great thing about what you have done with World of Change too, that the world where Wild Clown's set, where it's kind of a zombie apocalypse, but not like people are used to, although you do see a little bit of that at the very beginning of the Wild Clown series, is that you have several books that are set in that universe, but that don't require you to have prior knowledge, which goes back to kind of what you were talking about before, where you can't do a series if there's no demand for the series, but you still had this world that you built. And it was interesting to me that you could come back to that and have other stories of other types and tones even set in that world, but and maybe even be tangentially related to Wild Clown, but still be their own thing.
Yeah, again, it's playing, and it's when I'm writing, it's sort of in this, really, it's my happy place, right? And off you go. And so you end up with, you'll start I've been a fan of Sherlock Holmes forever as well. And this corpse character, similar in his detective skills, was always in the back of my mind. And so he would just sort of be like having a Gumby or whatever, or a G.I. Joe, and you could play with it in your mind, think, what could I do with him? And then before you know it, you think of the story, and off you go. And then again, thankfully, because, not thankfully, but the longer you work on a series, the bigger this world is, and the more potential doorways you can take to put new characters in, or maybe new stories, right?
Speaking of which, I know at the end of what is the trilogy called? The Four Horsemen trilogy, or
the Apocalypse trilogy?
The Apocalypse trilogy. It starts with Wild Clown. There's another book, and then there's the sort of apocalypse that happens. But you did say you're moving forward.
Fifth Horseman.
The Fifth Horseman, yes.
Yeah.
But you're moving forward, at least according to that. There was a little excerpt for coming next, in the Apocalypse world of Change. Is that still on track, or did I miss that somehow? Because that's possible as well. But
after the Fifth Horseman, sort of sets up another post-apocalyptic potential storyline for sure. Again, though, it's just
it's time.
It's time, and it's just, and also waiting for the ideas to come. Sometimes it takes a while because I really killed a lot of things in that book. Like that the story is finished in a lot of ways. They're nice little survivors, and it's kind of a nice ending. And that's another thing you think, maybe I'll just leave them alone. I've done enough there, and go and torment some other characters, which is always fun.
Do you have any other plans for any other kind of mashup type stuff? Because you've done Edgar Rice Burroughs with Dracula, and you've done Arthur Conan Doyle-esque type story. Is there anything else niggling in your mind that you're like, man, I really want to tackle this type of thing that you haven't got to do yet?
I would, I definitely, the end of Dracula the Apes kind of leaves him in this strange position, or basically as a character going off into the world. And there are a lot of potential places he could go.
So there might be a sequel to that. I have not yet got to the third book yet. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I'm going
I won't
to,
give anything
but
away, but
having to do with time and stuff, I have not managed to make the time for that one yet. I read the first few and loved them, and again, time, haven't got to it yet.
Mm-hmm.
But
definitely, that's one, and that I've got some ideas about. Just because he is an interesting character. And also, there are a lot of unspoken, there are mysteries that were left in the story that could have some life after the books. So that one, and then I'm doing a variant effect, another one of those, a sequel due later in the year. So
that was another one that was really good. You're just, man, how do you... you write a lot of stuff, is what I'm saying. I remember reading the variant effect and thinking, this is I've never seen anything like this, where so for those of you who don't know, the variant effect is about a world where people's desires can just blow up into, like, they become magnified. So if you have a problem with, like, women, like, the lust just gets, like, to be all consuming in your mind, or if you have a problem with eating, that will just take over
based on a prescription drug that is sort of this prescription drug called Varian in the story is kind of the villain of the piece and the people who created it. And this was intended to deal with psychological issues and other issues like that, but it ends up becoming toxic in the end. And then so we pick up the story 20 years after that happened, and so yeah, I'm just doing the third book on that one.
So I'm looking forward to that as well, man. I did gotta say, I wanted to talk a little bit about Dracula because the way you wrote that character was so interesting, because you made him the creature of the night and the vampire and the hunter that he is, and yet really gave him a lot of sympathy because of how he comes up. He doesn't have his memories. Whereas the first whole book is just setting up how he gets there, which I thought was fascinating as well. It's really a whole separate character about the servant who takes care of him, and I love that relationship as well. But once you get into him being with the apes and his kind of how he lives and how he thinks, it's not a Dracula we've seen before, but it's still very recognizably Dracula, and taken directly from the pages of Bram Stoker's book. And
well, thanks. I certainly myself always found through rereading of it, the Dracula character, he's often played in a romantic sense, and in movies and so forth. And in books. But I've also seen him just as an outsider. Like, I never understood his motivation for leaving this castle. I know it was a broken down old castle, but why would he was in charge up there? And then he ends up going back to the city, or going to London, where he knows no one but a crazy guy, Renfield. And you think, why would you do that? You had it all back home. You were the Prince of Darkness. And other than he missed something. He's a human at the core. And I think that's something about Dracula that appealed to me, is that he was lonely. He felt even though he was in charge of everything, there was something missing, and I thought that was interesting. And also,
it is interesting.
His plan was ridiculous. He only had all he had was one guy who was in an asylum. That was his sidekick. But what are you doing, Dracula? More planning. I'll just hide during the day, and no one will find. And it just seemed like a very risky business, bad plan.
Our movie for the podcast this week that we were going to talk about is Nosferatu.
Yeah.
And that takes a different, not quite as sympathetic look at Dracula, but he's actually portrayed in that, I think, maybe even better than the book if you're looking for a monster, in that everywhere he goes, there are hundreds of people that are being bitten such that they think it's a plague that is traveling around with this ship. And that, I think, makes him a little bit more scary. But as he's presented in the book, you're right, it's kind of a silly plan, and even for him it ends up not working out that well in the end in Nosferatu, but it never does really solidify, like, what is he gonna get? Does he think he's gonna win all of England and get them under his thrall? But he doesn't have anybody there. He's sort of outlived everybody, if you think about it. If he's immortal,
that's a good point.
And so he has this longing, and his servant senses that and really kind of longs to be with him and like him, but can't be because he's human. And I did want to ask also, this is just a particular interest to me, there are some stuff that you add to the mythos of Dracula, particularly in his incubation, when you make him a baby and a fetus and how that comes to be. And it feels it doesn't feel shoehorned in. It feels like this is a real part of how vampires work. Was that tough to come up with? Is it tough to come up with a lot, quote unquote, story logic for how vampires could come back from the dead, from being ashified, for lack of a better word, and make it fit in this story?
I would say that some of that lore, I think it was originated Dungeons and Dragons. I played a lot back in high school and in college, and for years after. And we introduced a character race of vampires, and we were trying to explain, how do they keep coming back? Like, there's got to be methods of doing that. And so it's kind of a combination of that, and it just seemed to make a certain kind of sense.
It does. It makes a certain kind of sense, but I would have never thought of it until I read the book, and then I thought, well, yeah, obviously vampires, you put them in the jar and with the ashes and keep feeding them blood, and eventually they turn into a little worm and the tadpole and the fetus, and then...
I found late, after I'd written that, I stumbled on Christopher Lee, one of the Hammer films, Dracula, and a servant pours the ashes into the crypt, into Dracula's crypt, and then it's quite gruesome, they hang someone upside down and lead them into the crypt, and then the smoke rises, but then you see a hand come up and he's wearing a shirt and everything. So it's, which has always been like, come on, got a shirt as well. But they never really explain that whole back to guy in a tuxedo and back again. But I think I sort of am driven to try and find ways of explaining some of those magical elements.
Well, it even fits in with Bram Stoker's other work, because you have his other book that I really like, even though it makes no sense, but there's something compelling about it. The Lair of the White Worm deals with the terror of this worm-like creature, and then you have the worm in Dracula coming back, so it even kind of ties back into that.
Yeah. I think, too, there's something about, like, that incubated larva. It also underlines the truth of what Dracula is. It doesn't matter about his personal story, whether he was sad or what. This creature drinks the blood of people to live. Like, it's not a... I see vampires quite often romanticized to the point where it's, hey, don't forget... Like, if you were at a family get-together and your sister's dating a vampire, eventually would go, look, I know he dresses well, he looks fantastic, but don't forget, he drinks people's blood. Like, let's stop going on about Count Maurice, like.
Yeah, people are real quick to dismiss the whole parasitic relationship that vampires have with humans.
Sure. And that's really, I think, where it's kind of the creepiest part. Well, it should be the creepiest part. It's interesting that it isn't as creepy anymore.
Well, I think there's probably a way to turn that on its head, too, because if you think about it, the idea of the vampire as this romantic figure is kind of one of their powers. The idea that they can seduce you and make you think of them as some wonderful, lovely being when they're actually a monster is... And now that's happening to our entire society, admittedly for a fictional character, but still, it's this interesting dynamic where we've taken the illusion and latched onto that's what we want. We want what they're presenting rather than what they really are, which maybe says more about the psyche of the culture than we'd like to think about.
Well, I don't know whether they do it in the what's the True Blood or some of those shows. Do they do it? Can you get a clear view of a vampire? Like, it would be interesting to see if someone could actually see.
They always have the good
are.
ones and the bad ones and the ones that only drink bad people's blood, and they have their little hand wavy things. I haven't seen True Blood. I watched all the Twilight movies, so you guys can crucify me for that. I didn't enjoy them particularly, but by the time the fourth and fifth one came out, I was like, I've watched the other ones. I'm gonna just power through. I'm gonna complete it.
We actually had a viewer question that's pretty related to this. I want to get that out there real quick. David Webb at Doc Occupant on Twitter asks us, why is the vampire such an enduring figure, and why do we keep trying to make them sympathetic?
That's a good question. I kind of wonder whether it's because my thought on that was just because people aren't getting to church as much, and that's not a judgment, but that because we don't have this religious view of death anymore, I'm just wondering, are people just afraid of death now? Because they don't go, well, at least they'll go to God's throne. Are they going, well, it would be nice if I could live forever because I don't know what's over there. And even if I have to kill other people to live forever, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. If there's not, you know what I mean? It's kind of maybe I get a sense maybe it's from fear that people want to.
That's an interesting observation. And something I've mentioned on the podcast in the past, the secularization of horror, where there is a very limited amount of horror now that deals with spiritual fears. And back when Dracula was written and stories like those, if you said someone was a demon, that would be horrifying. And as we mentioned, Nosferatu is not okay. Like, he's not a human person. He looks like something out of the pits of hell. But when you get people that don't believe in hell anymore, that don't care about, crucifixes and stuff, and don't have the ingrained belief in those icons, the vampire just becomes a guy with superpowers. And it's not that.
Or you could take a scientific approach and say it's an exotic creature that needs to be protected, right? And so I really think there's as you say, I'm just trying to think of even The Exorcist. I've seen a couple of exorcism movies recently, but none of them have had the same impact as The Exorcist, the original one of that, in terms of grabbing and dragging everyone into the whole religious Christian guilt hellfire thing.
I'll even compare to like the early 70s. Go ahead, Tony. Like even compared to the early 70s, like the secularization of culture hadn't really taken a hold back then. So I imagine seeing The Exorcist, especially because whenever I saw it as a kid, I was a lot more religious. Like that movie messed with my head because it felt so visceral and real for those reasons. Yeah. So nowadays you get like a movie where you almost have to build up like the belief idea beforehand. Like Constantine, you had to actually show how Catholic the world was to make it more effective beforehand.
Yeah, suddenly the backstory. Yeah, that's
and in every zombie. Sorry,
go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say in every zombie movie now, it's not some weird and I guess even in the original one they talked about that satellite, but now it's always a virus. There's always some scientific explanation rather than just dead people are coming back to life. This is not okay. Like we have to explain it and make it somehow natural instead of being like the original idea of the undead is horrifying because they're dead. They're not supposed to come back. Putting a virus in them does not make that scarier. It just means, now we're explaining it because we're all smart and stuff.
I think the last one that actually pulled that was Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, and it's like the only explanation you get is the preacher on TV saying like, when hell is full, the dead shall walk the earth, and maybe that wasn't exactly what was happening, but that was the only information they gave us.
Yeah, exactly. I just watched rewatched American Werewolf in London, and I don't know if you know the movie, but it's at one point the guy who's got the curse is being haunted by his buddy Jack, and his buddy keeps coming back and saying, "You're going to turn into a werewolf at the full moon." And so finally he goes, "What do I do, Jack? Do I need a silver bullet?" And he goes, "Come on, don't need a silver bullet. No, just a bullet will do, right?" And so you start to see that shift away. Even then, that was like late 70s, where the shifting away from the religious dogma as the backstory.
I might have to ask John Landis about that. I'll be at a Silver Screamfest in less than a month, so hopefully I'll be able to ask him if that was part of the secularization or not.
I was gonna say I can get the jump on you, Tony, because I just heard John Landis on the Famous Monsters of Filmland podcast, and he talked specifically about how that the idea of the supernatural, and he mentioned specifically vampires, and he described this sort of classic Bela Lugosi vampire, and he says, if you saw that guy on the street, you'd laugh at him if he said, "I want to drink your blood," and he had the big cape, because we don't think like that anymore. We know better, and so he approached that movie very much from the secular point of view. Yeah. Not to go back and review American Werewolf, which we did a couple episodes back, more than a couple, a little while back.
Probably about a year ago.
Definitely that was in his mind when he made that movie.
Oh, okay. It doesn't explain Jack, though, although Jack could be a hallucination. Well,
he wasn't taking away from the actual supernatural, but he was approaching it as someone who, in the modern vernacular, would not believe that. He was directing it from the standpoint of someone who doesn't take it seriously, and says, well, audiences aren't going to take it seriously, so I'm not going to take it 100% seriously. I think that the werewolf actually exists, which is, I kind of wish wasn't. I wish it was all in Jack's head, and if he had killed himself for no reason, and maybe he was killing people, but it was just, there's always been a hint of that in werewolf movies, where the people try to explain it away as some mental condition, and it would be neat to see one where that actually happened, but that's going kind of far afield.
Closest thing we get to that is Candyman.
That's true. So great. But I think we're about done with everything I had to ask Jeff. I didn't ever use your name. I made a big deal about it at the beginning. I never said your name. Very excited to have you on. Tony, did you have any further questions that you wanted to say before we wrapped it up?
I think we covered most everything I had. Like, I just wanted to say again, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for your books. Everybody go check them out. And where can they find you?
gwellstaylor.com.
And he has a lot of great stuff. They're all reasonably priced, especially if you're going e-reader. All their Kindle stuff is not exorbitant at all. If you have been or are poor like me and you're like, I don't want to spend $10 on a book, they're all really, really well written. So go check them out. Check out Wild Clown. Check out Dracula of the Apes. Look through the descriptions and see what catches your fancy. I'm so glad that I got to talk to you, Jeff.
Glad I got to meet you too.
It's been I can't believe so many. Well, not so many years. I'm relatively young still, but I mean, over all that time to come through this process, to have this podcast to build, and then to finally get to actually talk to you. I don't know if anybody else cares, but for me, it's sort of a culmination of something that I respect you a lot. I respect your pioneering into the world of ebooks, and I wish you every possible success because you deserve it. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.